April 14th, 1944. South of Cassino, Italy. Cold mountain wind dragged dust across the ruins of a shelled-out farmhouse as Oberst Heinrich Falk stepped over the broken stones, his boots sinking into mud softened by last night's rain. Far below, the Leary Valley lay quiet, too quiet for a battlefield that had been roaring only hours before. Smoke still coiled from distant American artillery strikes, but here, among the abandoned Allied forward positions, there was only the low groan of shifting debris and the metallic clink of Falk's field binoculars tapping against his chest. His men had pushed through this sector faster than expected. The Americans had withdrawn in the dark, retreating from an exposed ridge after a sudden German counterattack. Falk expected to find the usual: empty ammo crates, smashed radio parts, maybe a fuel drum or two. But he froze as he rounded the corner of the stone wall. There, half buried in churned earth, sat three enormous machines, hulking beasts of steel and mud. Their wide tracks were caked in clay, their bulldozer blades glinting faintly in the morning sun. They looked like mechanical animals paused in mid-charge. Herr Oberst, Lieutenant Weber approached cautiously, rifle slung over his shoulder. We found them just as they were. No signs of demolition charges. Falk stepped closer, running a gloved hand across cold metal. The machine smelled of oil, wet soil, and hot engine fumes long gone cold. He recognized the manufacturer from captured intelligence reports. Caterpillar D7 bulldozers, the workhorses of American engineer units. But he had never seen them this close. The blades were massive, thick steel slabs that could shove aside boulders, logs, even concrete fragments. Heavy frames reinforced the engines, making the machines look less like construction tools and more like armored beasts stripped to their plates. Falk knelt, examining the tracks. Deep grooves showed where they had churned uphill, pushing forward through terrain no tank could climb. A private called out from the slope above. "There are markings, sir. They were cutting a road up here." Falk climbed the ridge, breathing hard as he reached the crest. What he saw made him stop cold. Carved into the mountainside was a fresh, artificial path, wide enough for tanks. Trees were ripped from the ground, roots dangling like broken limbs. Rocks the size of small cars had been shoved aside. The earth had been peeled open, leaving a rough but navigable passage through what had been, just yesterday, impassable forest. Falk's stomach tightened. This wasn't ordinary engineering. This was mobility, manufactured, intentional, unstoppable. He had spent months watching the Americans grind forward, advancing even when terrain should have defeated them. German intelligence often reported Allied tanks appearing from impossible angles, emerging from hills or forests no panzer could traverse. But now, seeing the machines responsible, he felt a chill. The Americans weren't relying solely on tanks or infantry. They were reshaping the battlefield itself. A sergeant approached, carrying a small leather notebook found inside one of the bulldozers. Falk opened it, flipping through pages of scribbled engineering measurements, soil depth estimates, slope gradients, notations for culverts and drainage cuts. One line stood out: road needed by 0500 hours. Tanks must pass. No delay, Falk muttered under his breath. They carved this in a single night. He remembered the noise from a valley the evening before, a low, constant droning he had dismissed as distant armor. But no, it must have been these machines, working tirelessly, pushing, cutting, shaping. "Colonel," Weber said, "orders say we should transport usable equipment to divisional command. Do you want these moved?" Falk shook his head slowly. "You can't move them now. They are out of fuel, and even if they weren't—" He looked down the newly carved road, imagining American Shermans rolling through at sunrise, supported by infantry, artillery, and air cover. "Even if they weren't," he repeated, "we could not use them the way the Americans do." Weber frowned. "They are only bulldozers, sir." Falk turned to him sharply. "Nothing is only in this war, especially not this." He walked back to the quiet line of dozers. In their silence, he heard the truth. These machines didn't kill, didn't fire, didn't charge into battle. Yet they won battles. They shaped routes where no German tank could follow. They built roads where nature said none should exist. They cleared obstacles in hours that German pioneers needed days to breach. They turned mountains into slopes and forests into highways. And the colonel realized something else. Capturing these machines didn't matter. The Germans lacked the fuel, the spare parts, the crews, the doctrine. The Americans had entire battalions of men trained exclusively to operate and maintain them. Engineer special brigades who lived for this kind of work. Falk stood tall, dust drifting around him as the wind picked up. "This," he murmured, "is how they will cross all of Italy, not with tanks, but with roads, their own roads." The bulldozers sat quietly, but Falk felt them roaring, pushing, grinding, reshaping the war with every invisible stroke. "Sir," Weber said softly, sensing the gravity of the moment, "should we destroy them?" Falk hesitated. For the first time that morning, he felt something rare, an uneasy respect. "No," he said finally, "let them rust. They are powerful, but without the Americans behind them, they are nothing." But deep down, he knew the truth. With these machines, the Allies didn't just fight battles. They built their victory, one blade of earth at a time. April 15, 1944. Morning mist clung to the Leary Valley like a stubborn fog, hiding the American advance from German eyes. Falk's unit followed the valley floor cautiously, scouting what appeared to be a quiet, empty landscape. Yet he knew better. He could feel the invisible hand of the bulldozers at work, shaping the battlefield in ways his maps could not reveal. Hours into the march, the first signs became obvious. The earth was churned and compacted, soft soil replaced with temporary fills, slopes carved into gentle inclines. Bridges that had once collapsed under the weight of rain now stood solid, engineered with makeshift timbers and steel plates. Each crossing whispered a story of American ingenuity, of men and machines working together silently, deliberately, ahead of their combat formations. Falk signaled his lieutenant to halt. He dropped to one knee, inspecting the track marks in the mud. Wide, parallel grooves, distinct from any tank or half-track he'd seen, cut a perfect line through the terrain. "Do you see this?" he said quietly. They prepared every inch of this route for tanks before the tanks even arrived. Lieutenant Weber knelt beside him, tracing a finger over the mud. "Colonel, it's as if they knew we'd be here." "Not knew," Falk corrected. "Planned, engineered, controlled." They followed the tracks to a ridge overlooking the valley. From here, the strategic brilliance became painfully clear. The Americans were moving through a corridor that looked natural to the eye, but every inch had been painstakingly cleared. Fallen trees had been removed, boulders shifted, and mines carefully swept aside. The dozers were not just tools. They were the silent generals of this war, dictating where the fighting would happen and where it wouldn't. As the sun rose, Falk noticed smoke curling from the far side of a small forest. A detachment of Shermans emerged, rolling effortlessly down the path the bulldozers had carved. They looked unstoppable, their tracks following the invisible hand of the engineers who had gone before. Infantry moved in coordination, carrying supplies along routes that were far easier to traverse than any natural trail. Artillery pieces, heavy and unwieldy, clanked across the newly prepared ground without hesitation. Falk's stomach sank. Every obstacle he had relied on, the steep hills, the dense woods, the rocky creeks, had been neutralized. Where he expected a bottleneck, there was only open, smooth terrain. Where he thought he could position a defensive line, there was already a corridor carved for enemy tanks. "This," he muttered under his breath, "isn't fighting in the traditional sense. They're winning without firing a shot." A reconnaissance radio crackled in the distance, a German patrol reporting nothing to engage. The Americans were already too far ahead, their advance synchronized by the work of machines and engineers who never once drew a weapon. Falk realized that while his soldiers could destroy tanks, they could not destroy the roads those tanks traveled on. And without roads, the German panzers would struggle to maneuver, leaving them trapped or forced into predictable paths. By midday, Falk's patrol came upon another abandoned site, a cluster of bulldozers half buried in mud, engines cold, still bearing the scent of exhaust and diesel. Around them, trenches and wire had been hastily dismantled, leaving only broken posts. One of the dozers still had a canvas tarp draped over the operator's seat. Falk lifted it, revealing a logbook tucked inside. It was filled with precise instructions, soil depth readings, gradient charts, and notes on river fording points. Each page demonstrated a methodical approach. Terrain conquered before the fight began. Falk flipped through the entries, reading the names of engineers, crews, and supervisors. Each name represented a small army operating silently ahead of the front lines. He looked at Weber. "Do you understand now?" he asked. "They don't need to engage us to be winning. They engineer victory before a single shot is fired. This is why our defenses fail, because the battlefield is never what we think it is." Weber swallowed hard, the weight of realization pressing down. "So, even if we take these machines?" Falk shook his head. "Even if we take them without the men trained to operate them, without fuel, without coordination, they're just steel and dirt." He turned toward the valley, eyes narrowing as he tracked the distant movement of Sherman's, infantry, and supply convoys. Each unit flowed along paths carved in silence the night before, their advance preordained by the bulldozers and engineers. Falk realized that the Americans had created a war within a war, a battle of logistics, of terrain mastery, of preparation. And for the first time, he understood a bitter truth. His enemy had a weapon far more decisive than his guns or tanks. A small gust of wind carried the metallic scent of the bulldozers, and Falk inhaled it deeply. He didn't feel defeat yet, but he felt respect and fear. This was no ordinary tool. This was the invisible army, shaping the battlefield in ways no German could counter. April 16, 1944. Late afternoon, near the Garigliano River. Oberst Heinrich Falk crouched behind a jagged outcrop of rock. Binoculars pressed his eyes. Smoke from shelling rose lazily in the distance. Yet here, in this overlooked sector, the battlefield seemed almost peaceful. The quiet, he realized, was a trick, an illusion carefully crafted by the Americans. Below, the first Sherman tanks rolled steadily along a wide, freshly cut track. Their treads crushed saplings and small boulders with ease. Falk followed them, a mix of fascination and dread. They were not blazing a chaotic path through natural terrain. They were moving along prepared corridors, engineered for speed and efficiency. Infantry followed, their boots on firm ground, supply carts wheeling behind without obstruction. Every crossing, every incline had been anticipated by the silent bulldozers of the night before. Falk motioned his men to stay low. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Not a single tree fell by chance. Not a stone left unturned. Lieutenant Weber's gaze tracked the advancing troops. "So, every advance we've seen lately, every surprise movement, it was all planned?" Falk's eyes didn't leave the valley. Planned and executed, before we even knew it was happening. He recalled a skirmish the previous week, where an American battalion had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, cutting off a German supply line. At the time, he had assumed luck or a lucky reconnaissance. Now he understood. The roads and paths had been built days, even weeks in advance, silently, invisibly, by machines and men who never fired a shot. A sudden clang echoed from downstream. Falk peered closer and saw a bulldozer, abandoned on the riverbank, its blade embedded in mud. The machine was stationary, its engine cold, yet its tracks showed it had just cleared a passage for Sherman tanks. Falk imagined the crew working silently through night, carving a route where the Germans expected impassable terrain. He turned to Weber. "This is why our panzer divisions are always a step behind. They fight what they see, but the Americans fight what they've already prepared. The battlefield is theirs before they fire a single round." Weber shivered, understanding dawning. "So all those bulldozers, the ones we captured or destroyed, they weren't just construction equipment. They were tactical weapons?" Falk nodded slowly. "Exactly. A Sherman cannot move without a road. But these bulldozers, they create the roads that allow Shermans to move anywhere. Mountains, rivers, destroy bridges. It doesn't matter. The Americans just carve their path." A gust of wind rattled a nearby tree, and Falk's attention was drawn to another site, a temporary pontoon bridge spanning the swollen river. Its construction was crude, yet solid enough for tanks and trucks to cross safely. Falk could see the faint tracks leading to it, perfectly aligned for armored vehicles. "And every one of these they built silently, out of sight," he murmured. Falk's mind raced through his earlier campaigns in Italy. Every failed German counterattack, Every advance that seemed impossible to predict, it had been influenced by these machines. Roads cut through dense forests, obstacles removed before his eyes, artillery positions cleared ahead of time. The Americans had turned preparation into a weapon, an unstoppable force that required no bullets to achieve results. He realized something else. This method gave them flexibility. Unlike German divisions, which depended on predictable rail lines, roads, and supply chains, the Americans could create new paths as needed. Their mobility was unmatched. Where Falk expected choke points, there were open corridors. Where he set ambushes, there were none, just smooth paths leading forward. Falk's gaze lingered on the Sherman tanks disappearing into the mist beyond the river. The quiet hum of machinery and men moving efficiently reminded him that this war was won long before the shooting began. A sergeant whispered nearby, "Colonel, do you think we can stop them?" Falk shook his head, a grim shadow crossing his face. "No, not with our guns, not with our tanks. These machines, these roads, they fight for them. They will carry their army forward faster than we can react, faster than we can destroy. And by the time we engage, the battlefield will already be lost." He turned back to the abandoned bulldozer, the one silent steel giant now a symbol of unstoppable engineering. Falk understood at last. In this war, the Americans didn't always need to engage the enemy to win. They just built their victory one quiet, relentless stroke at a time. And for Heinrich Falk, the colonel who had seen countless battles, there was a bitter clarity. No amount of artillery could match the quiet power of a bulldozer that could move mountains, carve paths, and deliver an army to the enemy's doorstep before a shot was ever fired. April 17, 1944. Evening. Edge of the Urunsi Mountains. The sun hung low, painting the craggy peaks in amber and shadow. Falk's patrol trudged along a narrow ridge, weary from the day's reconnaissance. His mind kept returning to the bulldozers, the silent roads, and the advance he had just witnessed. But now, he began to consider the people behind the machines. A mile below, the faint silhouettes of American engineers became visible. Men moving with precision, unarmed, carrying tools and timber, laying down improvised bridges, clearing debris from what would soon be armor highways. Falk watched as one crew guided a dozer into position, the operator standing tall in the cab, his hands steady on the levers. In the fading light, it looked almost like a dance, man and machine in perfect harmony. Falk squinted. He could see the deliberate timing. As the dozer's blade pushed aside fallen trees, infantry followed immediately behind, trucks moved up the cleared path, and artillery limbered into position. It was a choreographed advance, as if the battlefield itself were being orchestrated. Lieutenant Weber broke the silence. "Colonel, these men, they're not just operator machines, they're conducting an offensive without weapons." Falk nodded gravely. "Exactly. And they are as dangerous as any panzer or artillery battery, because their work multiplies the power of every Sherman, every soldier that follows." The colonel remembered a report from the previous week. A German infantry unit had been pinned on a steep ridge for days. The Americans had simply built a bypass road, moving tanks and artillery around them. By the time the Germans realized the maneuver, their position was untenable and retreat was the only option. Falk now understood how it had happened, not by combat, but by preparation, by engineering. He lowered his binoculars, letting the image of the operators linger. They were ordinary men in ordinary uniforms, yet their impact was extraordinary. Each crew was trained not only to drive, but to read terrain, anticipate obstacles, and plan routes for forces they might never see again. Each dozer, each hand swing of a pickaxe, each plank of a bridge contributed to a silent, unstoppable advance. Falk felt a growing unease. We have soldiers, tanks, guns, but they all rely on terrain. And these Americans, he said, gesturing to the valley below, they control the terrain itself. That's why we keep losing ground. They shape the battlefield before the fight even begins. The colonel thought back to his own experiences commanding panzer divisions. His officers had scoffed at engineering units, dismissing them as support, auxiliary, non-combat. Yet here he was, seeing firsthand that the engineers were the invisible backbone of every advance. Without their work, even the mightiest tank column would be slowed, stalled, and eventually destroyed. A sudden rustle to his right brought him back to the present. A lone German scout appeared, eyes wide. "Sir, more Americans, bulldozers, clearing a ravine near the ridge." The scout whispered, breathless. Falk exhaled slowly, a mixture of frustration and awe. "It never ends," he muttered. "Every ridge, every ravine, every destroyed road, they rebuild, reshape, reclaim. And we fight only what they let us see." He looked back at Weber. "You wanted to know why we can't capture these machines and use them ourselves? It's not just the equipment. It's the knowledge, the timing, the coordination. The machines are powerful, yes, but the people behind them, they're the real weapon." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet earth and diesel. Falk closed his eyes briefly, listening to the distant rumble of moving vehicles, the scrape of steel on stone, the subtle rhythm of human labor advancing with military precision. It was a quiet symphony of war. For the first time, the colonel understood a deep, unsettling truth. In this conflict, victory was as much about preparation and engineering as it was about firepower. And in the Leary Valley, the Americans had mastered it perfectly. Falk opened his eyes, hardened his jaw, and whispered to himself, "We can fight them with bullets, but we cannot fight them with machines alone, not without first mastering what they have mastered, the battlefield itself." He turned his gaze to the valley, where the last rays of the sun caught the edges of bulldozer blades, glinting like silent sentinels. The machines rested for now, but their presence and the men who operated them had already won battles without ever firing a shot. April 18, 1944. Dawn. The Monte Cairo sector. A thin veil of fog curled through the valleys as Oberst Heinrich Falk and his unit made their cautious way along a ridge overlooking the American advance. The morning air carried the familiar scent of damp earth and diesel, the unmistakable signature of bulldozers at work. Falk squinted against the dim light, tracing the faint tracks that crisscrossed the hills like veins on a leaf. He could see them clearly now, dozers at the edge of a ravine, lowering steel blades into stubborn boulders, carving steps for tanks and trucks. Infantry followed behind, carrying ammunition, tools, and stretchers, moving with an efficiency that seemed almost preordained. In Falk's mind, the battlefield had become a chessboard, with each bulldozer, each engineer, laying the invisible groundwork for the next move. Lieutenant Weber, weary from days of observation, finally spoke. "Colonel, every advance we've seen, every breakthrough, it's all because of these machines?" Falk nodded. "Not the machines alone. It's a combination. Men who know how to use them, crews who anticipate obstacles, engineers who think 5 steps ahead. The bulldozers are the instruments, but the symphony is in their hands." He remembered the first time he had seen the machines, abandoned and silent. At that moment, he had underestimated them, thinking they were mere tools. Now, after days of following the invisible corridors they created, he understood. These machines, in the hands of skilled operators, were a force multiplier unlike any artillery or tank. As the sun rose higher, revealing the valley in crisp detail, Falk traced the path of the American advance. Every ridge scaled, every river crossed, every forest bypassed. It had been prepared long before German eyes had noticed. Roads carved into steep slopes, rubble cleared from narrow defile, temporary bridges erected across swollen streams. The Americans had already fought the battles with steel and sweat before a single shot was fired. A private approached, handing Falk a torn piece of paper found near one of the abandoned bulldozers. It was a field notebook marked with measurements, schedules, and small sketches of roads and gradients. Falk studied it, his brow furrowing. Each line represented hours of meticulous planning, every note a silent command for movement and mobility. He whispered to himself, "They don't just move an army, they move the land itself." Falk looked at Weber. "This is the lesson here. You can have the finest tanks, the sharpest rifles, the most disciplined troops, but without control over terrain, without preparation, without foresight, it is all wasted." Weber nodded, understanding the bitter truth. "So all these bulldozers we captured, the equipment we destroyed, it wasn't just hardware. It was knowledge, it was power." Falk's gaze returned to the valley below. A Sherman column had paused briefly, the soldiers checking positions along the freshly cleared road. The dozers waited, engines idle but ready, like silent guardians of the advance. It was clear that the Americans could repeat this process anywhere at any time, as long as they had men to operate the machines. Heinrich Falk inhaled deeply, the smell of mud and oil filling his senses. The fog lifted, revealing the full scope of the valley, and with it, the quiet genius of the Allied advance. Here lay a battlefield transformed, not by firepower, not by bravery alone, but by planning, engineering, and relentless preparation. Falk turned to his men, his voice low but resolute. Remember this. Remember what you see here. We can fight with courage, with skill, with steel, but never underestimate the power of preparation. Never underestimate an army that can shape the earth itself to serve its victory. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley, the bulldozers remained still for now. Yet Falk knew they were more than machines. They were the quiet architects of triumph, moving silently, shaping the battlefield, and winning wars without firing a single shot. And for Oberst Heinrich Falk, the lesson was clear. The war was not just fought in the open field with guns and tanks, but in mud, steel, and the hands of men who knew how to bend the land to their will. April 19, 1944. Late afternoon. The edge of the Leary Valley, overlooking Casino. Oberst Heinrich Falk stood alone on a ridge, the wind whipping his coat around him. Below, the valley stretched like a carefully designed stage set, every hill, every slope, every road meticulously shaped. The Americans moved through it with fluid precision, tanks rolling along smooth corridors, infantry advancing along paths that offered cover and stability, supplies moving unimpeded to the front lines. Falk watched silently, a bitter admiration tightening in his chest. The battlefield that had once been chaotic, unpredictable, and dangerous was now ordered, structured, and controlled by forces that never needed to fire a gun to dictate the flow of combat. Each bulldozer, each engineer, each plank of timber laid across a ravine was part of an invisible army, quiet, relentless, unstoppable. A scout approached, reporting German positions. "Sir, we attempted a counterattack along the western ridge. The Americans had already cleared and fortified the approach. Our tanks couldn't advance. Infantry stalled." Falk clenched his fists. "Exactly. Every failed maneuver, every blocked advance, it's not luck. It's engineering. It's foresight." He turned back toward the valley, eyes narrowing. "We fight the weapons we can see, but they fight the battlefield itself. And the battlefield always obeys them." He remembered the first bulldozer he had encountered just days earlier, abandoned, silent, yet terrifying in its potential. At the time, he had scoffed. But now, after tracing American advances through impossible terrain, witnessing their coordination, their preparation, he understood the full scope of the threat. The machines were not just tools. They were force multipliers, capable of turning mountains into highways, rivers into bridges, forests into clearings, all without ever engaging in direct combat. A distant Sherman rumbled past, a single metallic note in the valley. Falk imagined the countless others that had moved through similar corridors across Europe. Paths carefully planned, roads cleared, obstacles neutralized. The Americans were winning battles silently, invisibly, methodically, and the Germans could only react, always a step behind. Falk turned to his lieutenant, voice low but commanding. "We have always focused on firepower, on armor, on immediate tactics. But what we've seen here, this is a different kind of war. A war of preparation, of terrain, of movement. The Americans don't just fight us. They reshape the ground beneath our feet before we even know they are coming." Weber swallowed, realizing the full magnitude of Falk's words. "So, even if we capture their machines or destroy them, it doesn't matter?" Falk shook his head slowly. "It matters little. Without the trained crews, without the planning, without the logistics, the steel is useless. It is the people and their understanding of terrain that make these machines deadly. And that is what we cannot match. Not yet. Not here." The colonel breathed deeply, the scent of wet earth and diesel mixing with the distant smoke of artillery. He had spent a lifetime studying tactics and command, yet he had never confronted a force so subtle, so indirect, yet so effective. The Americans were winning battles without firing a shot, using intelligence, engineering, and relentless preparation as their weapons. Falk's gaze lingered on the valley below, where bulldozers waited silently at the ready, blades poised, engines cold but prepared for the next day's work. He realized that these machines and the men who operated them were reshaping the very nature of warfare. Mobility, foresight, preparation. They were now just as lethal as any panzer, any artillery battery, any soldier. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the lesson. For a German officer trained to fight head-on, there was no comfort in valor or courage alone. To confront this kind of war, one would need foresight, discipline, and a willingness to fight the battlefield itself. The wind picked up again, carried with the faint metallic echo of the bulldozer blades. Falk opened his eyes and whispered to himself, almost reverently, "They are the invisible army, and they will not stop." For Oberst Heinrich Falk, there would be no simple victory here. Only the stark reality that in the quiet labor of engineers and bulldozers, the Americans had discovered a way to win wars without ever drawing a shot. April 20th, 1944. Sunrise over the shattered outskirts of Casino. Oberst Heinrich Falk watched from a distant ridge as American engineers and their bulldozers began another day of work. The valley, already shaped by their labor, seemed almost surreal in the golden morning light. Paths carved through forests, slopes tamed, and rivers bridged the precision of an invisible hand. Falk's mind traced the sequence of events over the past week. Every advance he had witnessed, every miraculous maneuver by American forces, had been preordained by these machines and their operators. Every Sherman that appeared on an impossible slope, every artillery piece that reached a forward position, had done so not by luck, not by brute force, but by careful planning and meticulous engineering. A whisper came from Lieutenant Weber at his side. "Colonel, I think I finally understand. These bulldozers, they aren't just clearing paths. They're creating opportunities. Every move, every advance, it's a victory before the battle even begins." Falk nodded. "Yes, and that is why we cannot match them with guns or tanks alone. We are fighting what is already won. These roads, these cleared passages, they dictate where and how the battle is fought. They give the Americans flexibility we cannot counter." He glanced down the valley, seeing engineers guiding dozers across a steep embankment. One man swung a chain, guiding the massive steel blade into a stubborn boulder. The machine shuddered but pressed on, and in moments, the path was clear. Infantry followed. Supply trucks rumbled behind, and a Sherman tank crested the slope with effortless precision. It was a choreography of movement and preparation, perfectly timed, perfectly executed. Falk's thoughts drifted to his own panzers, trapped by terrain, stalled by obstacles, forced into predictable positions. Every failed maneuver, every ambush foiled, could now be traced back to the silent work. Roads built, obstacles removed, terrain reshaped. He realized with grim clarity. The Americans had created a war within a war, a conflict fought as much with preparation and engineering as with bullets and shells. He turned to Weber. "Remember this. Every officer, every soldier under your command, they need to understand what we've seen. We cannot underestimate preparation. We cannot underestimate the invisible work that makes an army unstoppable. These machines, these engineers, they're the architects of victory." The wind carried the faint metallic scent of diesel and steel. Falk inhaled deeply, feeling a mix of frustration and reluctant admiration. The Americans had discovered a truth few armies truly grasped. Mobility, foresight, and engineering could achieve more than brute force alone. As the morning sun climbed higher, the dozers continued their silent work, carving paths, clearing obstacles, reshaping the battlefield. Falk realized that while tanks and guns to destroy, bulldozers and engineers created. They built opportunities, removed limitations, and, in doing so, won battles without ever firing a shot. The colonel stood in silence, absorbing the lesson etched in mud and steel. The war would not always be decided by courage or firepower. Sometimes it would be decided by the quiet, relentless labor of those who moved the earth itself. And in that moment, Falk understood the full power of the invisible army. Machines without violence, men without rifles, victories won quietly, invisibly, and irrevocably. He exhaled slowly, a mixture of awe and resignation. The Americans had discovered a weapon the Germans could not replicate, not in machines, not in tactics, not in spirit. It was a weapon of preparation, foresight, and engineering, a quiet dominance that reshaped the battlefield itself. For Oberst Heinrich Falk, the lesson was indelible. The Bulldozers had done more to win battles than any artillery barrage ever could, and their operators, the invisible architects of victory, had proven that in war, sometimes the quietest hands wield the greatest power.